Alana,
Yeah,
can you tell me a story?
I can try. Once upon a time, there were two girls, nay, women,
Hell yeah.
who wanted to rewatch their favorite trash fairy tale program. They started with season 1, when everyone wore full makeup and they had no rights to Peter Pan. Spooky. Hello, and welcome to Pod Ever After. This is the first episode of Alana and Tessa's rewatch show of Once Upon a Time. As I said, my name is Alana.
I'm Tessa.
So just briefly, who are we? Like I said, my name is Alana. I'm 27. I live in the States. I am a writer and an avid TV watcher, obviously. And I am hoping to get a greater understanding of why I watch this ridiculous show.
I'm Tessa. I'm 19. I also live in the U.S. I write, I'm in theater, I sing, I'm a musician.
Wow.
And I already know why I'm watching this show, but I'm hoping to get a deeper, more sophisticated reason to watch this show, rather than just, it's cute and I like romance.
Way to totally show me up with all of the things you do, by the way.
They're all interrelated, okay?
Okay. So, the name of this week's episode is Fuck Off, Weirdo, which we'll elaborate on later. We'll be covering episode 1, which is the pilot, and then episode 2, which is called The Thing You Love Most. But before we get to the first episode, we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about why we're doing the podcast, and then get into a little bit, get some listener feedback, some from questions we asked some people.
So Alana,
yeah,
why are we doing this?
Why are we doing this? So it really all started because the season was ending, and it kind of seemed like they were wrapping up the storyline that, we had kind of all started watching, which had a lot to do with Emma, and Jen is leaving, and Emma and Killian got married, and so we were like, oh, let's rewatch the show from the beginning. And because I'm obsessed with podcasts, I said, well, why don't we rewatch and do a podcast about it and talk about the show? So that was one reason, and then another, I think, was because I really started getting into certain characters and storylines much later in the show's run. I'm really interested in going back to the beginning and seeing those new characters, seeing those same characters, but kind of from a different perspective. And so that's kind of why I'm doing it, I think. Why are you doing it, or why are we doing it, do you think?
I think that, as I'm trying to become like a more sophisticated like writer, rather than just kind of writing fan fiction, which is really good for a writer, but starting to develop my own world and my own characters, I noticed that I learned what it takes to build a world, build a setting. And so as I rewatch this, I want to pay closer attention to how Adam and Eddie have built Storybrooke and built the Enchanted Forest, and how these different realms interact, and where are their consistencies and what are the inconsistencies, and just stuff like that.
I think that's awesome, and I think that's a good idea. And hopefully you can learn from their mistakes and find out what not to do and what works and what doesn't. So I think it'll be interesting. So before we get into episode 1, we just want to briefly talk about some of the answers we got to the 3 questions we posted on the Pod Ever After blog, which is on Tumblr if you'd like to follow for episodes and other fun things. It's podeverafter.tumblr.com. So the 3 questions we asked people, we asked them when they started watching the show and for how long, and if they ever stopped watching it. We asked people if they agreed with the stigma that the show is kind of silly and how they might defend it to certain people. And then I think the 3rd question was, having watched the show all the way through, do you feel any differently about certain things than you did at the beginning? So, Tessa, what were some of the answers that you noticed that you found most interesting?
Well, we got a lot of them, and they were all really great in that they were in depth. There was like a variety of opinions and a variety of answers, and they all kind of said similar things. But for question one about how long people have been watching, Daisy3489 said that she's been watching since the beginning, and what drew her in was the idea that Snow White and Prince Charming would be in our modern world, filled with technology and other stuff that they didn't have in the Enchanted Forest. And I think that's what drew in a lot of the general audience when they were first kind of promoting the pilot way at the beginning, because they were basically saying, oh, these are fairy tales, but not as you know them. They're in the modern world. What's going to happen? And everyone was like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? But I think that was pretty much the same for me too, because I had been watching since the pilot.
I think,
And then I took a break and came back when my friend told me that they were doing a Peter Pan arc, which was a good idea for me.
I mean, I think what's funny about that is that, like, yeah, they have technology and it's the modern world, but it's still not realistic in many respects in terms of, like, yeah, they're
Right.
in the modern world, but so much happens that you're like, I don't know. So, like, I can see that being the draw in, but I think after at least, like, season one, especially, just that starts to not even matter. I feel
Right.
personally,
Yeah.
but
I think one of the things that they kind of toy with is being in the modern world, but still doing things by the rules of their own book.
yeah.
So if they don't want to pay taxes, or if they want to do their law enforcement differently, they're not going to have the U.S. federal government knocking on their doors being like, listen, you fantasy fairy tale town, you need to be doing things differently.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure no one in Storybook has, like, social security numbers or Medicare or
They should look into that, though.
they should look
Those are
into
some good
it.
benefits.
I mean, one of my biggest fantasies is that, like, Emma and Killian just say, fuck off everyone, and they leave Storybrooke, because Storybrooke seems like a terrible place to live, but I digress. Something that I noticed in the answers that I liked, or I thought was interesting, is that a lot of people kind of, and this kind of happened to me, is that they started watching it and they were like, oh, it's okay, I guess, it's fun, and they kept watching it, and then they got really into it. And I'm curious, like, to see as we watch the show, like, if that kind of happens again, like, where is the turnover? When it
Right.
stopped being like, okay, this is mediocre television, and then you got to a point where suddenly you get super entranced by it, and I don't know if that has something to do with the writing necessarily, or with each individual viewer, but I thought that was kind of an interesting comment that I saw a few times.
Yeah, I think just looking at like the answers that we got, it seemed like the general consensus was that the reason that people joined were for their investment in the characters.
Yeah.
Like maybe the storylines of certain arcs might be a little weak, but you want to know what happens to these characters. You want to know if they make it out okay. And I think the overall desire for a viewer watching this show is, do these characters get their happily ever after?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that one of the greatest strengths of this show is the character development, and I don't feel like the writers necessarily feel that or acknowledge that in the best way, which is what usually would end up frustrating me, but we'll get to that in greater detail later as the show continues. Was there anything else you want to talk about in terms of listener feedback?
Nothing other than the fact that we're very thankful for everyone who answered. It was really interesting to sit and read through all the different ideas. I was really grateful for everyone that sent in there.
Yeah, I was impressed that so many people did. I really didn't think so many people would. And one other thing that I almost forgot to mention that I liked was I was really interested in the question of whether or not people care that the show is really silly, because I've mentioned this to Tessa before, but this is not a usual show for me. I don't usually watch TV like this. And, like, when I had kind of come out, as it were, to my boyfriend at the time, who's my fiance now, so I guess it didn't really matter that much, but when I told him that I watched Once Upon a Time, he kind of laughed at me. Like, he didn't laugh at me, but he was just like, why? Like, he didn't really understand at all why I would watch a show like this, because it didn't really seem like me. So I guess I'm interested into getting an answer, because there were some answers from people that were like, yeah, of course it's silly, and that's fine, and you can tell people that. And I think that there are a lot of really funny moments or silly moments, but I think there's also some more serious, interesting topics that they try to explore in certain parts of the show that I think make it worth watching.
So, digging into it, Alana, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happens in the first episode, the pilot?
The pilot. In the pilot, we switch back and forth between the Enchanted Forest and Storybrooke. In the Enchanted Forest, we see Prince Charming and Snow White. Prince Charming kisses Snow White awake, and there's a wonderful rainbow, and it's glorious.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. We see the evil queen who floats through a palace somehow. I don't think we ever see her fly again, but she flies in the pilot very briefly. Prince Charming throws a sword at her somehow. We get back to modern-day Boston, where there's beautiful Emma Swan, who has lots of damage and is very sad. And her tiny son, who she gave up, Henry, comes and drags her back to Storybrooke, where it seems like she's about to leave, and then she realizes that she has to stay with her son because she's worried about his safety. And I'm pretty sure that's basically what happens in the pilot episode. So Tessa, what was the first thing that you noticed? And I think we both ended up actually noticing the same thing first.
Well, I think it's pretty noticeable, but in the first scene when David rides up on his stallion, he's looking sexy and determined, and then you get a look at his face and he's crying.
Beautiful tears.
Just beautiful tears.
Beautiful manly
and your heart
tears.
breaks. And so I guess I wrote down as my first note ever that I forgot how much David cries in this season. You don't see him cry nearly as much throughout the rest of the series.
Well, he's really emotional, I think. And
he is, but he does. I mean, he's crying every other second in this season, and then after that, it's just all emotion and no tears.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to pay more. I'm going to pay a lot of attention to David in this rewatch, because I got really into Captain Charming in the last few months. For whatever reason, both platonically and otherwise. And what I really loved about noticing that he's just full-on crying in the first episode is that I felt like it foreshadowed a way a lot of the other male characters behave in later seasons, especially Killian, where they're allowed to be emotional and feel their feelings.
Right, and then there's consequences that the men in this show face when they don't deal with their emotions properly.
Yeah, that's very true. So obviously, I love that the show opens with him and his bright red coat with sparkles all over it, and he's
beautiful,
super dramatic and amazing, and I'm excited to... I'm actually really sad now because I just realized that, like, for the first half of the season, he's, like, in a coma. So, like, I don't think we really get him except in flashbacks for, like, the first... half of the season, but that's okay. I'll get over it.
It's probably a little earlier than halfway because there's a lot of drama that he goes through.
That's true.
There's a lot of drama.
Yeah,
we'll have to see.
I forget so much of it in the first season, so yeah. So obviously another big part of this episode that we spent a lot of time talking about after we watched it is Emma Swan. Very important.
Who is the protagonist?
Tessa, I don't know if you realize this, but Emma Swan is the main character of this show.
I cannot believe it. That is actually news to me.
Isn't that really shocking that she's the main character? It's like about her and everything. Yeah, it's odd.
Wow.
I never would have thought. Something that I would like to talk about through a lot of this rewatch is how she looks physically, especially from the first episode into all the way up until the 6th season. because I know that there's been some commentary in the fandom or in the community that kind of criticizes her lack of makeup, um, and how fancy her hair is in later seasons, which I very much don't agree with. And my argument to that would be that in this first episode, she is all dolled up. She's wearing that beautiful dress. She's covered in makeup, and she looks gorgeous, of course. But as soon as she gets home from this, like, skip, she knocks her heels off. And you can clearly tell that she's far more comfortable not wearing them than when she was wearing them. So, you know, in later seasons when Jennifer Morrison is like, well, it doesn't really seem in character to me that, you know, she would continue dressing and looking that way in later seasons, it makes total sense to me. So I like seeing that in the first episode because I feel like it kind of proves her characterization of the character she played for 6 years. But
And I like seeing how in the first season she dresses kind of like simple.
Yeah.
She wears tank tops and jeans. She looks very comfortable. Looks great all the time. But then by the end of the series, she's wearing more colors, more flowers,
yeah,
things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think the show bets a lot on how physical appearance is in some way saying something about how the character has grown. So we'll obviously talk about that more later on, but I think it's established in the first episode, which is really awesome. Something else that we've talked about with regards to Emma in this episode is how shocking it is to see how sad she was in the pilot.
Yeah.
So and it's so interesting because, you know, she fulfills that classic, you know, strong female character trope, which has become really problematic in recent years.
Basically, all throughout the series, but it's different in the first season because she is sad. It comes off a lot more like aggressive,
Mm-hmm.
and aggression doesn't always equate like a strong, powerful woman. Because I think that she's really vulnerable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And
Absolutely.
A lot of her toughness is kind of like an act that she puts on, especially in the scene where she's catching the skip.
Yeah.
And as she like tells him about herself, she says, "Ready to run yet?"
Yeah.
And you can just tell that she's trying to be all coy, but that question comes from somewhere deep within her that alludes to the fact that people have not stuck around for very much.
Yeah, that's a truthful moment in a scene that's otherwise, you know, full of lies, where she's clearly just trying to trick this guy. But the way that Jen delivers that line, it actually looks like a genuine question, and I think that's a good way for the writers to kind of establish that this is kind of someone who's a loner and isn't really confident in relationships or having relationships. So I think that's a really interesting line that I'm glad that they had in there. Something else. Okay, so I should probably explain briefly why the name of this episode is Fuck Off, Weirdo. So I was watching the pilot with my fiance, who was sitting on the couch doing other things, and he doesn't really like the show, but he'll like stick around or hang out while I'm watching it and offer little bits of commentary because he thinks he's hilarious. And I was watching this episode, and Rumpelstiltskin makes an appearance in this episode, and he's very creepy in this episode, more so than in later episodes even. And I wish they had let him be creepy, but alas.
He's a little
creepy, but he's
thing.
Definitely the creepiest he ever is in the first episode. But as I'm sitting there and he comes on screen, you know, Jake is sitting on the couch, not really paying attention, but then he comes on screen and I just hear "fuck off, weirdo" on my to the left of me, in reference to Rumpelstiltskin. So that's why the episode is named as it is. So what else in this first episode did we find interesting?
I commented about this. I think this subject is a little touchy for more than one reason. But in the pilot, we see the first appearance of the Blue Fairy. And there are two things that, you know, there are two opinions on this character. That one, she's very suspicious, very shady, does a lot of weird things with twisted motives, or that she's just a gal trying her best, and that she's well developed. She's not, like a Mary Sue character, that she's got faults, but she's also at her heart genuinely good.
Yeah.
And then I'm pairing that idea with something I've seen talked about on more than one occasion by fans of the different ships and stuff. So this seems to be kind of like a general thought that some people have, is that the show often uses sexuality as a way to depict a villain, meaning cleavage. And
The more cleavage you have, the eviler you are.
The more evil you are. Which a lot of feminists are, I guess, rightfully angry at, because, I mean, even Emma, she shows off a little bit of cleavage when she's not, when she hasn't embraced her role as the savior.
Yeah, I think she's far more overtly sexualized in this season before she's, capital S, the savior, later on, which I don't know if this is something that they're doing on purpose, they don't realize they're doing it, and it's just this kind of...
Because, I mean, it's Regina, it's the Snow Queen, it's Maleficent, and I think the list just keeps going.
Yeah. And then, we see, Snow and Charming get their, one sex scene, but they're a married couple. So,
and it's more like smoochy smooch rather than a smoochy smooch.
Hot and heavy, yeah.
Hot and heavy.
We'll definitely talk about it more in different episodes, because it's not super overt here, but it's definitely something that I noticed after watching multiple seasons and, feeling the frustration of, why do some characters get to have sex on screen all the time and then other ones don't? And I think it's a bigger question than just wanting to see it. I think it's a larger issue that we'll get to at a later date, but it's definitely something that we noticed in the very first episode. So
combining those two ideas of the blue fairy potentially being kind of shady and sexuality being used to depict a villain, why the cleavage? Like, my girl Blue is endowed. You go, girl. She is such a small human, a small little fairy, and the Lord has gifted her with just some stuff that the show decided to show off.
I mean, it could also be just as simple as, we're trying to attract more viewers, so boobs. I mean, I hope that's not what went through
I feel like, yeah,
their minds.
Or it could just be like the costume designer was like, this actress has it going on, so we're gonna take advantage of that. But it's also something interesting to think about, because every time I see her on screen in that dress, I'm like, there is so much boobage going on.
There is a lot of boobage.
There's so much boobage.
There is.
So, just something to think about.
So when
as you continue to watch the Blue Fairy, do you think are her boobs out because she's shady, or does she seem shady because her boobs are out? I don't know.
It's a good question. We'll keep it in mind. One last thing to talk about for the pilot, of course, is Henry Mills. Yay!
Oh, sweet blossom.
Henry. What was interesting was when I first started watching the show, I found Henry really grating and irritating, and rewatching the first episode, I don't feel that way at all. And I don't know if that's just because
you
honestly
were a college student who didn't like children.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like children now, but I don't know if it's because of what he's gone through or what we know he's going to go through, or how I've come to understand other characters he interacts with, but I had a lot more sympathy for him this time around. And I
just thought it was funny that he looked for Emma on www.who'syourmama.org. And that to me is just...
We were concerned about, because there's no way that he typed in the URL who'syourmama.org. He probably Googled something, but you have to wonder what he must have stumbled across.
Right, like what if he
beforehand.
typed in who'syourmama.com? What if .com and .org are two completely different websites, and that is the reason why Henry Mills has grown up so quickly.
.com is
Because
probably
he has seen things.
a porn site.
I
The
am not willing to find out for myself.
The org
if
is
indeed
supposed
it
to
is.
be. Wait, I'm gonna do it on my phone.
Oh gosh.
I'm gonna do it. Now you've talked about this so many times that now I have to find out what happens if I type in.
You can tell
who's
that
your
I'm a woman scorned.
mama.com.
You can tell that I've just had too many encounters of just typing in the wrong URL and
There's nothing there if I do .com. If I do .org. Wait, I just typed that wrong. .org. Nope. I think.
All right, we are.
So you're safe.
We're in the clear.
We're in the clear.
Safe?
I bet you. But it's the mama in the show is spelled MOMMA, which is weird.
Really?
I think so.
I don't know. That's how MOMMA. That's how I always spell mama.
I saw MAM. No, MA.
But you don't call your mom Moma.
MAMA. Mama. Okay, this is too long of a conversation we're devoting to this. Anyway. We can't get stuck on things like this in future episodes. So something that will end up, when we talk about 102, will become far more relevant, is that we're dealing with a Henry Mills who seriously doesn't believe that his mother, for all intents and purposes, doesn't actually love him. And Tessa and I were saying that that's a very serious, sad character trait of Henry's that I feel like gets ignored or glossed over by the other characters and by the writers, ultimately, because it's never really dealt with, I think,
Nope.
in a satisfying way at all. Because, I mean, if you just put yourself in his position where you're this tiny kid and it's not even like you're a kid and you're throwing a tantrum because your parent didn't do what you wanted them to do and so you don't like them. He, like, genuinely thinks that someone is taking care of him who does not care for him at all. Like, it's not like a momentary thing.
Yeah. I think it also explains kind of why, we see, especially as the series continues on, how Henry, more than once, tries to do things for the greater good.
Yeah.
And accidentally makes them worse. And his intentions are good, and basically he just wants to be the hero, and I think he's trying to earn, the love of the people around him, and they keep telling him, you don't gotta.
Which is
You're already a hero.
Which is what Emma does to a certain extent, I think, too. At the expense of her own happiness, is I think she does a lot of things to make sure that the people that she's found aren't going to leave her, which is part of the reason why I think Killian is such a good match for her, because, and obviously we can't talk about Killian too much because he's not on the scene yet, but I will mention that he is one of our more selfish characters, which I think, obviously too much of that is a bad thing, but when you're dealing with someone who is so selfless that they're willing to, shorten their own lives or harm their own chance at happiness, I think you need someone who has to kind of take a step back and be like, hey, wait a minute, why don't you maybe do this for you? Or why don't you maybe put yourself first before everyone else? Which is why I think they're such a good match. But we'll get to that later.
Yep.
Maybe we should have this disclaimer now. We totally forgot to mention in the beginning that
we are Captain Swan.
Yeah, it's on our Tumblr, but we just think everyone should know that both Tessa and I really enjoy Killian's character. We enjoy them, Killian and Emma, together. So if that's going to be a problem for people, this might not be the podcast for you. But we'll try and to treat every character with some degree of respect.
Non-partisan.
Yeah, do our best. But yeah, so that was basically episode 1. We'll just take a quick break, and then we will return for episode 2, The Thing You Love Most. So don't go away. And we're back. So we're back to talk about Season 1, Episode 2, The Thing You Love Most. Tessa, would you like to tell us what happens in this delightful episode?
Sure. So Emma, having decided to stay in Storybrooke to protect her son, is trying to settle in, and she notices right away, just as the viewer does, that things are very odd. There's a lot of manipulation and things that are looking pretty shady, and she's kind of feeling that there's some stuff going on, but she can't prove it yet. And we meet Granny and Ruby and Gold in Storybrooke. And then on the flip side, in the Enchanted Forest, we see what Regina had to do to cast the curse. So in that respect, it's a very Regina-centric episode.
Yes, it is. So before we get into whatever else happened in this episode, Tessa and I were both quite enamored with the fact that it opens and an actual song plays by Sir Cat Stevens, who is an amazing folk artist. If you haven't listened to him yet, you should. He's from around the 60s and 70s. But we were both reminiscing about how we missed the fact that Once Upon a Time used to have, like, an actual soundtrack, and we are sad that it doesn't anymore.
As a folk music enthusiast, it's just mixing my two favorite things, my favorite show and my favorite genre of music. I was a happy camper, and I couldn't shut up about it. It's just, amen. God bless.
Yeah,
Hallelujah.
I'm very sad that they didn't. I mean, I know it costs money to get copyrighted songs and stuff, but I think if they were trying to inject a tone of seriousness into their fairy tale show, using actual music probably could have helped with that. So I don't know why they stopped doing it, but I do miss it. It was a nice little moment that I appreciated. So another thing this episode is we actually got an ask a few days ago where someone was interested in talking about Dragon Queen, which I thought was an interesting question because I never really paid much attention to them. And so there's only one very brief scene with them in 102, and unfortunately Tessa didn't do her job and watch it, so I just watched it.
I'm under the bus. Well, Alana,
And
what did you think of said Dragon Queen scene? What were your thoughts?
I actually thought it was a very interesting scene because, full disclosure, I am not the biggest fan of Regina. There are things about her that I do like later on, but I think there's a lot more wrong with the character than there is right about it. But what I found really interesting about that scene, and what kind of made me sad, was that Maleficent really is a very interesting character, and she kind of gets thrown under the bus a little bit in later seasons. So we only see her a few times, and then it's just, nothing. So what I thought was really interesting about that scene is that Regina calls Maleficent her only friend. And of course, if you watched later on in later seasons, you get that whole thing where Regina kind of pulls Maleficent out of her, like, depression or whatever. And that happens before, I assume, she comes back and steals the Dark Curse from her. And I thought that was a weird moment because it's hard to know how genuine she was being with that comment when she kills her own father shortly thereafter. So right away, I feel like that scene kind of makes you question Regina's loyalties and what she cares about. And I wish we did get more scenes with them because I think it would be interesting. And I think Maleficent would have been a really good a foil or a friend to Regina because she's obviously wiser and calmer in a way that Regina is not. And I think it would have worked to our benefit to have Maleficent around more.
Yeah.
So it made me kind of... a running theme for me with Once Upon a Time is that I think there's lots of ways to potential, and so this was just another example of that for me, that they didn't give Maleficent and that relationship more time and space to grow. So that was my thoughts on that scene. It's a very short scene. It's like 4 minutes, so unfortunately I don't have that much to say about it, but I will definitely keep an eye out for them in later episodes now.
I definitely think that, if Regina were to have a lady, that Maleficent could be a very good match for her. I think they
Yeah, I
have
think
a
so.
lot in common. And Maleficent balances out some of the things that maybe Regina needs some help with.
Yeah, I agree. I think Regina is one of those people that needs a little tough love sometimes. Um, it's so odd. I can never tell how we're supposed to feel about the relationship with her father. Like, first of all, I really hate that she calls him daddy. It makes me super uncomfortable. I don't know how you feel about it, but like she's like a grown ass woman and like he's just like quivering all the time and he's just like, "Oh, honey, oh blah blah," blah. And she's just like, "No, daddy." And I'm like, "Ugh." Like it just does totally
I
turns
know,
me
because I
off.
feel
I'm
like
not about it.
the reason they probably did that is because, like, but I mean, she can't call him dad because it's not appropriate to the setting, but then she also probably couldn't call him father because that would be a little formal for what I think they're trying to get across.
I don't know. I think
Maybe
you could
she's trying to use, like, her, what's left of her childish innocence to manipulate her dad. I don't know. I'm
I
just
guess. I mean, this show seems to have a weird thing with calling parents like the fact that Balefire calls Rumpelstiltskin Papa all the time always really annoyed me too. I mean, like I don't. There's just something like I'm like, can you just call like Emma at some point starts calling David like Dad, and it sounds totally normal. It's fine, and I'm like, why are these like? I understand they're in the Enchanted Forest, but come on, like it's just a little weird. I don't know.
them's
That's
the
my
rules,
2 cents.
Alana. I'm sorry. Them's the rules.
Those are the Enchanted Forest rules. Um, but so another thing in this episode, let's take a break from Regina for a second and let's talk about Graham for a little bit because Graham is in this episode.
He is.
Um, so Tessa, how does Tessa feel about Graham?
Um, I feel like I'm mostly indifferent because I like Graham as a character, but when he died, I'm not like, well, I guess spoiler alert, but if you're, I guess chances are if you're listening to this, you've probably watched the whole thing anyway. And
If not, we
it's coming up
apologize.
right around the corner, my pals. But what I thought was interesting is on the surface, he's a lot like Killian, and kind of deeper inside, they're quite different. But for the sake of appearances, Graham, he wears a lot of leather, he's got an accent, he's got the stubble, he's hella into Emma Swan, and I mean, even sometimes they kind of walk the same. I don't know. I think that, like, if you were to just kind of be very familiar with Killian Jones and then look at Graham, you'd be like, wow. But also, I think that the writers were making sure when they introduced Killian that they were not introducing another Graham.
Yeah, I mean, like to be fair, this happens to female characters all the time where one lady is killed off and then another lady is brought in and they're essentially the same woman. I don't think that's exactly what's happening here. I think it's happening here a little bit and it's kind of satisfying as someone who sees that happen to female characters all the time. But I agree that in the end they're pretty different. And the reason that we were saying that we think that they're in the end they're different is we think that Killian is a lot more suave. He's a lot savvier. He has a lot less to lose. He was a villain in a way that Graham is absolutely not a villain. But again, you have with Graham, you have the really interesting emotional component that we were talking about earlier that David has and that Killian has. So I think Graham had the potential to be a really interesting character, and I am sad that he was killed off. I don't think even if him and Killian had been on the show at the same time, I still am not sure I would have thought he was good for Emma, but I think he would have been a rich inclusion, certainly more than August. I'm not a huge August fan, so I would have been fine with Graham sticking around, I think.
Yeah. I think, because I'm looking forward to seeing that episode where there is kind of a Emma Graham focus where she starts to open up to him, because that's really the first time that, other than Henry, that she starts to open up to someone.
Yeah.
And how that affects her when that's suddenly taken away. I'm excited to
Yeah, that's gonna be
think
good. I
about that.
know. And of course we can spend a decent amount of time after that episode complaining about how he is murdered and we don't get any justice for that. We won't go into it
We're not
now.
better, but okay. At all.
We're not there yet. We won't get to that yet, but that will be coming down the mountain. And then the last thing in this episode that I guess we'll talk about, we'll return to Regina because this is a Regina friendly episode. How Regina treats Henry.
I'll give you a one-word answer.
Yes.
Poorly.
Really
It's
badly.
Really, really poorly. Now,
like
granted,
just
no one's perfect. I'm sure that there's plenty of people with crazy mothers, crazy parents. But one of the things that I noticed is that kind of this episode does a good job of making the distinctions between Emma as a mother and Regina as a mother. Because by the end of the episode, Emma makes the choice to go along with Henry's, quote,
yeah.
delusions for the sake of his own happiness. Because Regina sets her up and she calls it crazy and then he gets really hurt and she decides that that's not how I want to treat my son.
Yeah.
Regina continues to lie and manipulate Henry, making him think that he's just going crazy for the sake of her own happiness, for the sake of keeping the curse alive.
Yeah. Which
So
is
that pissed me off.
Yeah, that made me really upset. I didn't like that in any way, shape, or form. And like we were talking about in the first episode, this show does not return really to Henry's emotional well-being at the hands of someone who would do this to him because if you've lived with an abusive parent or you've grown up with some kind of emotional trauma, like that kind of stuff doesn't just go away. And I feel like in the show they kind of make it seem like it does, which is odd to me because they allow Emma to really see Emma suffering and growing out of that and still dealing with it even up until the very final season. And for some reason with Henry, they don't apply that to him, which again is odd considering the fact that you've got David, you've got Killian, you've got Graham, who are kind of more emotionally resonant male characters, and then what Henry doesn't really get that opportunity. And to me, that's another instance in which these Adam and Eddie seem to have this obsession with Regina but it's weird because they seem to really like her and they want her to stick around, but they don't characterize her in a way that makes it easier for the rest of us to want her to be around. So I don't know.
And it's weird because the show is very inconsistent with the way it characterizes its villains. Like there are some villains that go through a redemption arc. Some of them are successful, some of them aren't successful. And it's good to have a little bit of diversity in that aspect when you've got so many villain characters. You don't want all their redemption stories to be the same. But at the same time, you can't recognize that one character did a ton of terrible things, go to all the trouble to make them say, this is my fault, I have to make up for it. And then to have another character be like, oh, that wasn't me. That was the other half of myself that is completely separate. That's a season 6 thing, and you can tell that I'm incredibly salty about that.
Yeah, I wasn't crazy about that storyline either, and we're not there yet. But I think it'll be interesting to kind of follow Regina's arc from this first season and see if we get to moments where we're like, okay, here is where they should have made the decision to either make her the big bad or allow her redemption arc to actually take place, because it just is dragged on for so long to the point where I don't even care about it anymore, and it just becomes irritating for me to watch, and I just don't want to bother with it. So I think getting to a point where we can be like, okay, this is where it should have happened, will be an interesting spot to come to, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that was episode 2. So our next episode will be episode 3 and 4, and I actually don't have the titles in front of me because I am ill prepared right now. But until next time, I want to thank you guys for listening. You can follow our Tumblr, podeverafter.tumblr.com. We also have an email address, podeverafter@gmail.com. You are free to send questions or comments that we've talked about today.
Suggestions.
Try and be suggestions for what we can talk about for future episodes. We appreciate that not everyone is going to agree with us, but if you could disagree with us as politely as possible, so Tessa doesn't cry, that would be great. So until next time, I'm Alana.
I'm Tessa.
And Tessa, do you want to take us out?
Sure. We hope you live pot ever after.
Yay!
Wait. I screwed it up.
No, you didn't.
I didn't?
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Till next time.